Hey, welcome to Friday and my lunch hour. Stan the Energy Man here, Stan Osserman from HTDC and the Hawaii Center for Advanced Transportation Technologies on our lunch hour show, doing energy stuff. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the grid. And all of our grids across the U.S. are vulnerable. So vulnerable to cyber attack, vulnerable to kinetic attack, as we say in the military. And complicating everything is we're trying to go clean, and we're trying to integrate renewable energy into grids. And that's not as easy as you think. You can't just plug it in and make it all work. We're kind of used to and spoiled by being able to plug in and just take the electricity and pay our bill, but it's a lot more complicated when you have to generate the power and make all the customers happy and give them good quality power. So today on our show we have Dr. Matthias Fripp.
That's right.
Outstanding name. I'm deadly serious. That's the coolest name I've ever heard. And I'm glad to have you here today, Doc. And you come to us from the University of Hawaii. And can you tell us just a little bit about your background, how you got to Hawaii, what you do, and where you're at in the university? And
Sure. Well, I'm in the Department of Electrical Engineering. They brought me in when they were looking for someone who could begin teaching power classes there again and doing research in that area. Electric power kind of went dormant as an area of interest for people sometime in the 90s. I think the last person teaching about electric power systems retired in the 90s and wasn't replaced, and that's kind of typical nationwide. It got to be a mature industry which wasn't very attractive to new grad students. And but they wanted to hire someone who could work on renewable energy, which is obviously a big issue here in Hawaii. And so that's kind of my background. I started in this area, at least kind of mainly in grad school. I was in a master's and PhD program at the University of California, Berkeley, called the Energy and Resources Group. And I picked that really because it was a place where you could do sort of hands-on energy-related projects. And this was right at the start of people worrying about climate change, and I was worrying about climate change. And I thought, well, I could maybe make better solar panels or something. I didn't quite know what. And that program is sort of an interdisciplinary program where you can kind of go any direction you want. And I, at some point along the way, thought, well, let's figure out how much renewable energy we could use in the grid, because everyone says, let's have 20%, let's have 30%, let's have 40%. Well, no one was saying 40% then. It was more like 10 and 15%. And I thought, well, everyone seems to be stuck at 10 and 15%, and why is that, and how much could we use? I thought, well, I'll spend a few weeks and get the answer to that, and that'll be cool. And then it wasn't a few weeks. It was kind of
into a career.
It turned into, a career. I said it turned into a dissertation, but actually, a career. So I spent the next few years kind of working on that. Sort of realized it wasn't as much a technical question as an economic question, because you can always put more stuff in the grid. I mean, you can build all the solar panels you want until you run out of land, all the wind turbines you want, all the batteries you want. So it's really a question of, most of the choices you could make would be pretty expensive. So then it becomes more of like a question of how much is it going to cost and what's the best way to do it. And so it sort of shifts over into more of this kind of interdisciplinary question between economics and engineering. And then I finished my work there. I got a postdoctoral position in England at a place called the Environmental Change Institute at University of Oxford, working on sort of the carbon implications of adopting renewable energy. And then I got hired from there to here in Hawaii. And actually, it was funny because my wife and I had come to visit a little before then in 2010 or so, and we just loved it here. And so we started sort of looking for, even then actually I went and met with people at UH who were working on renewable energy stuff, and was like, let's start working together so I can get here someday. And then this sort of coincidentally, about the time we were ready to move, they announced this position in the Department of Electrical Engineering, and so it was a good match, and we came here, and we've been here since then. And I mean, it's an amazing place to work on, what does it take to use a lot of renewable energy? What does it cost to use a lot of renewable energy? When we came here, there wasn't 100% renewable portfolio standard, but it was clear that this could become the first place to really go totally green, totally clean power. And that was really interesting and attractive. And it's a great place to work. It is a great place for renewable energy generally and for work on it. So.
Yeah, the DoD, the U.S. Department of Defense, does a lot of work here in renewable energy because of the cost of power.
Yeah.
And it's nice that we can come off fossil fuels, but for them it is an economic issue. It's 30-something cents a kilowatt hour versus 10 or 7 or 10 or 15 cents in other places on the mainland that have hydroelectric dams or have nuclear power or have coal power. And so it is a big economic thing. And like we say, if it doesn't work in Hawaii, it won't work anyplace.
Yeah.
Because we have, one of the worst case scenarios in terms of, we pay too much and it's all dirty. So
Yeah.
we've got to clean it and we've got to work the economic piece too.
Yeah, and I think for the military, I mean, I haven't really engaged with them as much as I could maybe. I've been more focused on the overall grid side of things. I think for them, they're also concerned about readiness and like being able to
Sure.
to have energy where they need it when they need it. But yeah, this Hawaii is sort of best case scenario, you could say, for renewables. Worst case for fossil fuel. We're the only place in the country that still burns oil at all for electricity. Everyone else, oil and the price of oil has kind of moved way above the price of other fossil fuels in the last few years, because oil itself is a bit scarcer and it's the only thing we can put in cars, and people are willing to pay a lot for it for cars. So that price goes up while the other fossil fuels stay cheap. And so that's kind of come, well, until sort of this year,
Right.
that's bitten us pretty hard here.
But, the volatility of fossil fuels, whether it's because of an international crisis or economics or leveraging to get our natural gas folks out of business so that the oil prices go, whatever it is,
Yeah.
the economic implications are always there. And for businesses and transportation folks who rely on a fuel to do their job, that volatility drives them crazy because they can project for costs, and then when the reality hits and they're only charging so much to move something, and then the price of their transportation fuel goes up, suddenly they're in the red. They're hurting economically. They're laying off people because that's the fastest thing they can do to recover, and then you have big issues. So
Yeah, and it affects like I'm sure it affects the big hotels here, and probably affects room rates in some way. It certainly affects the University of Hawaii. We were at the peak. We were spending something like a quarter of tuition dollars on electricity
Energy,
because
yeah.
the oil price goes up, electricity price goes up, and we all see that in our home bills. But for UH, it was like someone was calling it an existential threat to the university as it was, because that money's got to come from somewhere. And meanwhile, the legislature was cutting back funding, so there's everything goes into paying the energy bill and keeping the lights on and the cooling on.
You touched upon something else that I have found in my current line of work, and that is that in the past we've always thought of oil, gasoline and diesel as transportation fuel, and the grid is, home power and business power.
Yeah.
But the farther we go down the road, the closer those things come together. They're competition for the same fuel in our case, but also when you start plugging cars into the grid, they not only are a draw of power, but they're also storage on the grid if you choose to use it as such. But that brings in its own set of challenges and issues with how do you switch the power back and forth, when do you draw it, what's the right way to do it. The infrastructure in Hawaii is blessed that we were one of the first cities in Honolulu to have electric power, but by the same token, the same thing that plagues us on our streets is the same thing that plagues us on our grid. We started off kind of just thinking, hey, this ought to work, and didn't really have a master plan. And now, 100 years later, we're trying to fix things that we didn't plan for. We didn't have enough wide roadways, and we probably don't have a really well-designed grid for the electric company to use, and they're just doing workarounds in a lot of cases.
Yeah, I haven't assessed, sort of the robustness of HECO's grid. I think going back to this, do we have some energy sources for transport and some for electricity? And we've gotten stuck using the transport fuel for electricity. They've kind of been separate, but I think that's in part because their prices have been so similar that it was easy enough just to keep running cars on oil and keep running the grid on coal and gas. Lately, natural gas has gotten really cheap while oil went up. And you saw a lot of, and this is a real headache when you're trying to forecast, but,
Right.
So when oil prices were up, everyone said, okay, we're not going back to where we used to be. Everyone used to think we'd always come back to $20 a barrel. And then suddenly everyone said it's going to go up forever. And then they said, well, gas will keep going flat forever. And then now oil prices have collapsed. So now what's the new forecast? Who knows? So partly there's a big headache trying to figure out what are each of these going to cost. And it's so easy to get it wrong. Like if you look at any past forecast, it's always, where are we now? And if we're high, it's going to go back to where it used to be. And if we're low, it's going to come up. It always sort of starts where we are now and goes off to sort of, you get this fan. I haven't described it very well, but the forecasts always reflect current conditions, basically. And they're never any good. So we're trying to do some work to sort of model what if we just don't know what fuel prices are going to look like and how does that affect planning. But also, sort of embedded in there is this issue for Hawaii of, we don't know generally whether fossil fuels will be expensive or cheap, but we also don't know, right now people are saying natural gas will be cheap and oil will be expensive. We've never seen that kind of huge gap open between them. That's what, the U.S. Energy Information Administration, who does all this kind of forecasting, that's what they're saying now. And people are sort of starting to plan around that and talk about bringing in LNG. I mean, there's not much set in stone, and Hawaii Gas actually has done something interesting there. But there's this issue that, okay, they've never been that wide apart before, and to some extent you can interchange them. You can decide to use electricity for transport, which takes away some demand for oil, which cuts the oil price, or you could use gas for transport, which raises the gas price, because you can, if oil prices are sort of quadruple the price of natural gas, people are going to start putting it in their cars. You can't say we're going to have 4 decades of cheap gas and expensive oil. So that's a challenge there. But
well, as we move forward in the future, and we haven't had much chance to talk about what I do in my real job, but I do hydrogen and hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, and that's where we start to go, well, if you want clean hydrogen, electrolysis is the way to go.
Yeah.
But if you're going to do that, now you're competing with the same renewable electricity that they're trying to fix the grid and get it 100% green on. So that's where I'm saying we're getting closer and closer where that interface between transportation and grid power are starting to come closer and closer to the point where PUC, who regulates the electricity and regulates the gas company and others, they've got to start looking at their policies and making sure that they can adjust and adapt their policies to take care of both sectors. Because the grid, like you say, we're at what, 18% penetration now on renewables in the grid side. But we're not doing really good on gas savings on the transportation side. We're trying to catch up, but our competition is all the same renewables that the electric company is going to have to start incorporating into their grid.
Yeah, so I think that gets to an interesting point, which is that so fuels are very, we talk about fuels, fossil fuel, this kind of fuel. We don't realize how special a fuel is as a fuel. Like a fuel means it's a chunk of something physical that you can move around that contains a lot of energy.
Transportable.
So it's transportable is one, but it's also storable.
Yes.
And electricity is very difficult to store long term. And so fuels are pretty good for cars. I mean, they're great for cars. You can drive 300 miles without getting any more of them. And then you can refuel in 5 minutes. And that's the transportable part. Electricity is also pretty transportable, and you can transfer fairly quickly, not quite as quickly. So we may need fuels for long road trips, but we don't really need fuels for transport for normal driving. Like, we don't need something we can store long term because the car is going to refuel. It's plugged in, it can charge every day. And we don't necessarily need something that's easy to carry. Batteries are good enough to carry cars around. So it's actually maybe a bit misdirected to be creating fuels or using all our fuels for cars. We may need them more for long-term storage for the grid, and we'll talk about that later. But I guess another point I was getting at was we don't have good renewable sources for fuels. So there's been some interest in biofuels, and on the face of it, they look pretty good. But there's still, agriculture. We were worried about the impacts of agriculture on the environment, before we started worrying about climate change, and to grow fuels, you basically need to take land that could have been used for food or for wildlife or for some other use and dedicate it to energy crops. And if you grow soybeans here to make biodiesel, then you're using up soybeans, and then they're going to go clear more rainforest in Brazil to grow more soybeans. And so it's kind of, there's all these negative impacts of biofuels.
Yeah, there's not necessarily an economy of scale when you start going to massive biofuels.
Yeah, but that's the only renewable fuel that we know how to make right now. And so, but we know lots of ways to make renewable electricity. And so I see actually the grid as a hub where we can dump in. You can dump in low-quality biofuels. You don't need, liquid biofuels for cars, which is what we focused mostly on, are very hard to make. You can grow, woody mass and throw it into a coal-type plant and burn it and make electricity pretty easily. It's a lot harder to use wood chips to drive your car. I'm not saying that's the way to go,
Right.
but you can use an easier-to-produce form of biofuel for the grid. But you can also use wind and sun
Sure.
and geothermal and wave if that pans out. On the grid, and then it can become this hub that you can then use any of those for home heating, for home cooling, for transport if you have electric vehicles. But the thing that's missing is, okay, how do we take all this easy to produce renewable electricity like wind and solar and store it long term? And that's,
Right.
I think, where hydrogen comes in, is that we get these seasonal balances that I'll talk about later when we go to those slides. But
Okay.
Hydrogen is great because you can store it for months, and there's no other way to store wind and solar power for months. So
Great.
that's special. So
Okay, well, we're going to take a short break and come right back, and Dr. Fripp's going to talk about his slides that he brought, and we're going to get the 101 course on grid energy and how complicated it is. So we'll be back in about 60 seconds.
Hi, I'm Ethan Allen. I'm the host of Likeable Science on Think Tech Hawaii. We talk about why people should like science, why science is actually fun, how science is a dynamic and vital part of everyone's life, why everyone, every man, woman, and child on the planet should really know science, should love science, should be familiar with science. So it's a great show. People come on here and have interesting conversations with us. They tell us why they do what they do, why they love it, why we should love it too. I hope you'll join us every Friday, 1 to 2 p.m. And of course, you can see it anytime on YouTube. Aloha.
Hey, welcome back to my lunch hour. Stan, the Energy Man, here with Dr. Matthias Fripp from the University of Hawaii Electrical Engineering section, and he's going to give us a crash course on grid energy. We've got some great graphs here that he provided for us, and he's going to go through them and look at them and tell us what we can glean from his work so far. So we can throw that first slide up.
all right, so I should say this is pretty preliminary. Well, I'll talk more about that as we get into it. Now I've got a bunch of slides here. It's a format that usually works better in conferences and classrooms, but hopefully it won't bore the viewers too much. So what this slide is meant to show is kind of the big challenges in sort of summary form that I see if you want to build a grid that's using 100% renewable power. And really what I focus on is the energy balance, because that's the hardest thing to get right. We worry about the fact that when it comes right down to it, we worry about the fact that we only get solar power during the day, we only get wind power when it feels like being windy, and we might need power at other times.
Right.
So what this graph is trying to show is the sort of horizontal axis. Each of those strips that you see vertically arranged left to right
One day,
is
right?
one day. That's kind of a random day from 2045. And these are days with the same weather as we had in 2007 and 2008. And then the red line that's in there is the amount of electricity demand that we have in Hawaii. And it's again just taken from 2007 and 8 and scaled up to the future. Okay. So we have this kind of midday peak and then an evening peak when everyone comes home and does dishes and whatever.
Yep. And then the blue is the wind.
And then what I've tried to do is I've said, well, what if we tried to build enough wind and solar power to provide, to fill all the area under that red line, which means producing enough power every hour. And so I've put here enough wind and enough solar that the total amount of wind and solar there is equal to the total amount of energy that we need for the year. And this is also based on the weather on those days. But the problem is, you can see on the left side, we get too much power during the day from all this solar. To get enough total energy for the day, we end up producing too much in the day and then too little at night.
So the takeaway from this slide is you need storage.
Well, I haven't, all I've said is the takeaway is that this is a challenge that we have to address. And we'll talk about, and that ends up being a big question, is how do we address this challenge?
Right.
So we have this daily day-night energy balance that we have to maintain. And then actually what ends up being a more significant problem, and it gets less attention, is that there are some times of year when you're going to have a lot of renewable resources, and sometimes of year when you're going to have less and still have high loads. And so on the West Coast, spring, they've got tons of wind power, tons of hydropower, and not enough demand to use it. Here we have most of the year, actually, we have pretty good sun, but then we have those periods in sort of October and November when there's a lot less sun, and so then if you've built enough total resource to get you through the year, on those particular days and even weeks in the fall, you just don't have enough. You could have all the batteries in the world, but you're not getting enough sun each day to get through the day. So we have this seasonal imbalance, which is a much tougher thing to address.
Okay.
And we have a lot of options available to try to address these, maybe more than people realize. We can use batteries, we can build big batteries or small batteries. We can potentially do pumped storage hydro, where you pump water uphill during the day and then let it flow downhill and make electricity at night. We can do what I call demand response, which is basically give people an incentive to use power during the day instead of at night when the sun is up. There's also biofuels. You could just burn a bunch of biofuels to fill in the gaps there, and then hydrogen storage. So there's actually kind of too many options to figure out what to do with them, or at least it's not obvious when you look at this which of those options should be used in which way. It's a much harder planning problem than anyone has ever faced. Power systems used to just say, we've got high loads at these times and low loads at these times, and we can build 3 different kinds of power plant, and let's pick, which combination of coal and gas plants is going to give us the cheapest power, and we'll just turn them on and off when we need to.
Okay.
That is a fairly straightforward planning problem. The problem we have now, trying to fill under those curves that I showed you, is much harder. And no one's had to do it, so there aren't really any tools to do it either. The sort of conventional tools that utilities use aren't equipped for that. So what I've ended up doing, what I did in my dissertation work, was to build a model that can make all those choices for you about how much of each thing to build in a way that's going to give you enough power at all times, and do it at the lowest cost. And you can sort of constrain it. It's a computer, and you tell it, here's what I want, and it tells you here's a way to get there that's cheapest. And then you say, well, I'm not liking that, you've got to do something else, and then rerun it, and you get a new answer that meets your new
project
constraints.
for growth in the community and things like that.
Yeah,
you have to adjust for.
Yeah, and so one thing that I did, well, we can even talk about it in a second. I've been playing around with sort of, what if we have biofuels or not? What if we have hydrogen or not? So we could probably go on to the next slide. This is just a description of the model, and I think we'll leave it up there just long enough for people who really care to look at it. But it's basically a fairly straightforward optimization model. The choices that it makes for you, or that it sort of reveals, the numbers that it spits out are basically, here's how much to build of each of those different technologies that I was talking about, and here's how I think you would use them on each day. And it picks those in such a way as to minimize total cost and to respect any sort of physical constraints on the system and also policy constraints. So this slide really shouldn't be on TV, too many words for TV. So then the next slide shows, I think, what the daily, well, we could come back to this, I think, but
next slide,
that's to telegraph my findings. But this shows what the daily energy balance looks like. And so this is really just a close-up on one day from that graph I showed you before. And in this first scenario, what comes out is a lot of biofuels. So we have the band of wind in there and then a band of solar on top of it. So the left side of this graph is showing a stack of all the different generation energy sources that we use to meet load for the day. The bottom couple slices, the very bottom slice is the H-Power facility. Then there's pellet biomass being run in the AES power plant. I'm not sure if that'll still be in effect. running in 2045, but something similar might be possible. Then a bunch of biodiesel, particularly in the morning and the evening, and then we take a bunch of wind and solar and use some pumped storage hydro when we can. And we get this, sort of total load profile that you see on the left. Then on the right, what I have is the lower gray band is the same electricity demand that I just showed you. Mm-hmm. So this is how we use the power. The left is how we produce it, the right is how we use it. There's a dark band on top of that, which is electric vehicles. And I've made a sort of middle, it might be a conservative assumption, it might be an optimistic assumption, which is that the electric vehicles are just going to charge sort of smoothly over the course of the day. So some people will charge at 1 a.m. and some at 2 and some at 3, and it'll be kind of a flat load, which is the easiest load to serve with traditional generators. If we don't give people any incentive, actually, that's all going to come right on the evening peak,
right.
And it'll drive up demand then, right when we're already having to turn on all this biofuel. So anyway, then we've got electric vehicles, enough for basically 100% adoption. This scenario is ending up with, I think it's actually, so it's a little hard to tell the color difference between hydrogen and batteries, but the next red band on top there is batteries. There's no hydrogen in this scenario. So we charge batteries during the day, which increases the load, and then you can see them sort of being discharged in the morning and night as part of the production. Okay. And then there's the light blue band on top is we pump water uphill during the day, and then we let it flow downhill at night. So the tops of both of these match, so we are producing what we're consuming, which is what we have to do in the grid. So this isn't really dealing, you said it'd be a primer on the grid. It's really more of a primer on like this one key issue of how do we balance energy production and consumption hour by hour in the grid. So that's one day, and it works, so that's good news. The next slide, I think, shows how this ends up looking for the whole year. And each day, the day I just showed you was, I think, the April 9th day. But each day looks pretty similar to what I showed you before. You kind of use wind and solar when they're available, and you fill in with biofuel. But we do end up filling in with a lot of biofuels in the later, that fall part of the year. Right. You see all that green in there. Right. And that ends up, if I offer it sort of unrestricted amounts of biofuel, that ends up at like 28% of our energy production, which is, that's a lot, and that would either be a lot of import dependence still, or a lot of land devoted to biofuels here. And that, I'm not sure that we would want to go so heavily. I think when people think of 100% renewable standard, they're not thinking, well, we're just going to rush, we'll use some wind and some sun and a huge amount of biofuels. So So then the next thing I did was to say, well, what if we can't use 28% biofuels? What if we say that wasn't our goal here, and we restrict it to something like 5% biofuel? Then that gives you this next slide. And this does drive up the costs by about 10 or 15%, I think. So we can restrict it. And in that case, what we do here is we've managed to squeeze out the biofuels in the fall, and we pretty much stop using them the rest of the year. The rest of the year we use a combination of more solar energy and more batteries, basically. And that's a little bit more expensive solution than biofuels. The other thing that happens here that's much more subtle is now, in order to get through the fall without using too much biofuel, we have to actually build quite a bit of extra solar so that on each of those fall days, we'll have enough solar production to get us through the day. And that means the rest of the year we've got extra solar power that we don't need. And that shows up as this kind of light gold band on top. That's solar power that we end up throwing away because we build extra solar capacity to get through the fall. So those building more batteries and building extra solar facilities that we don't use are expensive, and that's what drives this up by 10 or 15%.
Would a reasonable option be to maybe shift some of that battery storage to, like you say, hydro, pump in water uphill, and only pump it when you can kind of predict? And maybe pump less water uphill, and then when you know you're going to need the extra, then pump more water uphill?
I haven't dealt with predictability here. I kind of assume you can make a pretty good guess and a pretty good plan each day. And if you look at these slides, you'll see both batteries and pumped hydro are being used. And in fact, they're almost substitutes for each other. They both can give you storage for sort of a few hours to a day, but they're not something you would build on a big enough scale to get multi-day or multi-month type
Okay.
of storage. So they're kind of interchangeable, and the choice between them ends up coming down to, I think pumped storage, at least at current prices, probably comes in a bit cheaper than batteries. And it does have other benefits that may make it worth.
Yeah, life cycle costs, I would imagine, would be cheaper.
Yeah, it's very durable, and it can support agriculture if we want
Right.
to do that. You have irrigation and maybe some flood control. So it may have side benefits that make it especially worth considering. But in the end, it kind of comes down, you can do it with either pumped storage or batteries or a mix of both. And we probably don't have as much pumped storage as we would want. So we may
Okay.
need some batteries on top of that.
Okay.
So that's, but I think the next slide that I have to show is another way to deal with this excess capacity, which is, so now we've moved on to saying, what if we could build hydrogen facilities? So this gets back to what you were saying. What if we could, so this is basically, we can build an electrolyzer, which will take electricity whenever we want to, run it through water and split it into hydrogen and oxygen. We refrigerate, well, we compress the hydrogen, we can store some of that and use it for night on the same day without liquefying it. And then the rest we refrigerate down to nearly absolute zero. So it becomes a liquid and we stuff it into a giant insulated
Cryocooler,
tank.
yeah.
And that actually, the numbers, I wasn't sure how it would work out, but the numbers kind of work out to do multi-month storage for that. So
Okay.
it's kind of storage on the scale that NASA does for their
Fuel
rocket
for the rocket
programs,
fuel,
although
yeah.
I don't know how many, they're not doing manned rockets anymore, but
But there's a
it's
lot of
also
data
a
on
similar
that.
scale to, it's a different fuel, but it's a similar scale
Right.
to the oil storage we have now. So you liquefy the hydrogen, store it in a big insulated tank, and then when you need it, you pull it out, run it through a fuel cell, and make electricity. And life cycle, that's not tremendously efficient. It's like 37%, I think I found, and there's not huge costs, but significant costs for it. But if you're otherwise going to be throwing away solar, which was what we just
Yeah.
saw, then you almost have free energy to make this hydrogen.
Right.
And so far I've been focusing, this is a different use. You know, most people when they talk about hydrogen, they're focused on using it for transport. And I'm not totally sold on that. I bet we could have a good conversation about that. But I think it's pretty straightforward to build a big stationary hydrogen
Right.
facility. You produce it on site, you store it on site, you use it on site. So you don't need a distribution infrastructure,
Exactly.
you just use it as needed. And so if we look at that graph again, this ends up dropping the costs back down to sort of competitive with the big biofuel solution. So hydrogen, which is the sort of big red bands that show up in there,
Okay.
ends up as sort of a drop-in replacement to some extent for biofuels. And it also starts to crowd out batteries. So this scenario doesn't have a lot of batteries, which are the darker red band on top.
Okay.
And so that saves us cost. And we also are no longer curtailing, there's almost no curtailment of solar here. There's no,
Okay.
you're not throwing away solar power.
Well, I know you got a few more slides in. We're going to take a quick break, and we're going to come back to the slides and let
Okay.
you run through the rest of them.
Okay.
I hate to interrupt, especially during hydrogen, but we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back.
All right.
Hi, I'm your host on Think Tech Asia, Bill Sharp. I look forward to you joining us each Monday between 4 and 5 o'clock when we film right here in our studio in downtown Honolulu. The show, Think Tech Asia, focuses on contemporary events in Asia. And by Asia, we mean anything from Hawaii, south to Australia and New Zealand, west to Pakistan, and as far north as the Russian Far East. Clearly, this is one of the most economically dynamic centers of the world, and we bring you up to date on what's going on in a whole host of countries in this very vital region. We look forward to seeing you. Aloha.
Hey, welcome back to my lunch hour. Stan Energy Man here with Dr. Matthias Fripp from the University of Hawaii, talking about grid storage and grids and everything grid. We're kind of focusing on Hawaii specifically and talking about the challenges that we have on our grid system here. And let there be no doubt, HECO has quite a challenge in front of them to meet the kind of mandate that the state government, the legislature, and the governor have asked for, which is 100% renewable energy by 2045. That's a pretty tall order, especially when you put in clean power and all the renewables only work some of the time. You know, you've got all kinds of issues to deal with. So Dr. Fripp, thanks for being here, and we'll get back and keep talking about your slides. What's in the next slide there?
So there was one other sort of option that I showed back on the first slide, and that was demand response. So far we haven't had demand response in there. And so what this is showing is, and this, we don't actually know how much demand response is out there. There's a lot of opportunities for demand response. You can have a lot of our energy loads here are air conditioning, and you can, for home scale air conditioners, you can make ice during the day, or say during the morning, and then use that to cool in the afternoon and evening. For large scale facilities, you could store chilled water or store ice. So you can shift the bulk of the energy demand to the time when it's available, you know, most easily. And electric vehicle charging could happen at the best times of day. Home water heaters could become smarter and reheat at the best times of day. So here what I've done is I've said, what if we could just take 30% of our demand at all hours and reschedule it to the best hours? And so now what we have is, if you look at the lower part, which is the energy consumption, the original energy demand was the dotted line, and now we've reshaped that to the sort of gray, light gray band. So we've pulled down the nighttime loads and pushed up the daytime loads when the sun is there.
Okay.
And that's, I would expect that to be in response to some kind of price signal, because it actually costs more to deliver power at night. You're having to, in these scenarios, you're having to burn biofuel or cycle batteries or do something expensive to deliver power at night. So it's actually cheaper to give it to customers in the day. And if you tell them that and charge them less during the day, then they'll hopefully
Shift
move
that
demand
curve,
to the
yeah.
day. So that actually ends up being another substitute for, it plays in the same sort of space as batteries and pumped storage. It can give you a sort of day-night energy shift. And so
From a practical perspective on that, though, would that mean that we would have to change all of our meters at our house so that they're, you know, what time of day? I mean, HECO could literally tell you what time of day you're using electricity and charge you the appropriate rate.
yeah, and I think that the trend is in that direction already. People talk about we're all going to have smart meters, and the minimum definition of a smart meter is that it's going to measure your electricity use and report it back to the power company without them sending out a meter reader. But pretty much every real smart meter also can measure energy use hour by hour or 15-minute blocks instead of for the whole month. So generally, the smart meters that we're talking about having are enough to support this, and they'd probably go in for other reasons anyway. So we get this dynamic pricing, which it gives people a reason to shift to the day. We get a higher daytime load, which is kind of a no-brainer that you'd want to do that, and a lower nighttime load. And then on top of that, we have these other resources. But basically, by rescheduling demand, we can build less batteries, and then on top of that we have hydrogen and pumped storage, and that makes up our demand profile. And then on top we have our production profile, which matches pretty closely. And now this system ends up costing about the same as a pure fossil system. So this ends up, it's about 10% more than if you just, or with my current forecast, if you just burned fossil, which is probably liquefied natural gas.
Maybe something that the legislature could look at, or at least conscious companies could look at, is offering charging for vehicles at your parking stall at work.
Yeah.
So that when you have all the PV available and you can match a load there when you have the supply.
Yeah, and that's something
and not be charging at night.
That's something I didn't point out on this graph. I mean, there's two things to point out. One is that all the EV charging is happening during the day. And that's really where we should be headed. Like those dark bands in the lower part are all during the day. I mean, it just doesn't make sense to charge EVs at night when you're producing solar power in the day. You've got to have another whole battery somewhere and give up 20% of the energy to store it in the day and deliver it at night. So that's one issue. And then the other is, this is a very different kind of power system from what we have now. I mean, it looks, this was actually the one I showed you on the first slide where it looked kind of crazy. Now, hopefully it doesn't look quite so crazy, but it's, you know, we don't have any traditional power plants running most of the time there. There's not even biodiesel or wood chip plants running. It's all solar, wind, a little bit of hydrogen, but often hydrogen is on the margin consuming power rather than producing it. So you'd be raising and lowering the rate of power consumption by the hydrogen electrolyzer rather than raising and lowering the amount of
it's a load when
electricity
you need it.
production.
Yeah.
So we're not controlling production anymore, and we're controlling consumption. And so
Okay.
some of that's on a utility scale where if they, if it's a big hydrogen facility, which it would be, they can ramp that up and down. But some of it, all that demand response, which saves us about 20%, in this scenario, saves about 20% on the power bills. All of that is millions of devices that are sort of getting a price signal and dynamically responding to it. And so in this context, it's sort of a different vision of the utility. They're more like someone running a stock exchange rather than a grid with big generators that they turn up and down. Instead, they're just finding the price that gets supply, which, right now we take it as if demand is ordained by God and we adjust the supply to match. In the future, it's kind of going to be supply ordained by God and we adjust the demand to match. And that's,
Okay.
a totally different way of running the grid and running the power system, and it requires new capabilities.
Is there room in your model here where that hydrogen production could be actually increased to also accommodate the transportation sector? Are there efficiencies there in economy of scale by making that part of it a little bit bigger, but also servicing transportation?
Sure. There's two ways that transport could intersect with this. One is that I don't think transport is a very seasonal load.
Right.
So to some extent, it doesn't really matter whether it's EVs or hydrogen. That slice that I show electricity going into EVs, that could just as well be electricity used to make hydrogen to put into hydrogen vehicles, if that's where we go. And the other thing is, there are some economies of scale, particularly in the storage. And so if we already want to build a big liquefied hydrogen system for storage for the grid, then we do have at relatively low incremental cost, we could produce extra hydrogen for transport, potentially. So I think it may. The other way you could go with hydrogen for transport is more the first, what I said, where you'd have hydrogen production at the fueling station.
Yeah.
And this, again, is the grid acting as a hub because it delivers the power to the fueling station. So you don't need a huge network of hydrogen pipelines. And the fueling station maybe they make the hydrogen at the cheap times of day each day, and then
store it.
you use it. Yeah, because they could do day-night storage and compressed hydrogen probably.
Okay, well, what do the rest of your slides look like? I don't know how many.
That's
you have.
about it, I
Is that-
think. The last slide is basically the cost of these things. We could go back one. This is the all fossil scenario. We just stick with the solar we have already, and we don't build any new renewables. It's like a ban on new renewables. And this costs sort of 15 cents. And now I look at that and I think, that's so boring. But that's basically how we run the power system now. It's sort of, except this has LNG instead of oil. If you're just going to use fossil fuel, that might make sense.
Yeah, and this actually graphically gives you an example of how complex the solutions are going to be. This is pretty boring. It's pretty simple, pretty basic, not a whole lot of movement. But when you start to look for the solutions, they're not easy.
Yeah.
They're complex. There's a lot of big spikes in there you got to deal with and everything.
Yeah. So
that
then
actually is really good.
So the last slide is just the sort of prices of all those scenarios I talked about. So the last one I showed you is that gray bar. The cheapest thing we can build if we're not allowed to build new renewables is about 15 cents per kilowatt hour. If we just say there's no hydrogen, no demand response, we're just going to go and we can't use much biofuel, that really backs us into a corner, and that gets the highest prices, and those are, 23 cents or so. So, that's almost 50% more than the all fossil approach. But on the other hand, if we can use hydrogen and if we can use demand response, that backs the prices back down to where we're on a sort of par with the all fossil fuel approach. So
Great.
That's kind of what I'm trying to show here.
Well, that was really awesome, and thanks for taking hydrogen in there. I know we didn't plan that, but
Yeah, well, I hadn't been doing much with hydrogen until recently, but there's been a lot of interest in it, and I was curious about it too, so I kind of whipped something
great.
up and put it in there. And I should say this is all done, this model that I built called Switch, it's an open source model. So I wrote it during my dissertation time, and then I published it as open source software. There's a group in Berkeley that's using it a lot, and there's a group in Japan, and a few other people that are using it. So it's getting some more traction, and we've just rewritten it in a way that's much easier to use, and so people can write extra little add-on modules. So hydrogen was kind of like, write a few dozen lines of code and stick it in, and now we can model hydrogen. So it's a nice,
Great.
it gives you this kind of flexibility to say, well, what if we could do that, and what if we could add this, and what if we couldn't do that? And you sort of turn the crank and you get your answer, which is, it's a nice capability to have.
Awesome. Well, believe it or not, we're 45 minutes into this show and we're zapped out of time, but
Okay.
that's good because I got a whole nother show to talk to you about. We've got some great things to discuss. We didn't even talk about, okay, what about rail? When we bring rail on and we run that by electricity, what is that business model? I mean, because transportation, that's another piece that's going to that's a big power draw.
Yeah.
But we'll have you back next time and talk more and more about this because this is really interesting and I appreciate you being here. You're an awesome guest with some awesome stuff, and you're doing great work. So keep it up, and we'll have you back.
Okay, great,
All right?
thanks. Yeah, sorry,
Thanks,
I
Doc.
tend to get carried
No,
away and keep
I'm
going
just as
past any
passionate as
time
you,
limit.
so I know how it is. You get passionate about this stuff when you get into it, and it's really a good thing. But I appreciate you being here. Well, that's going to do it for Stan the Energy Man this week. Thanks again to Dr. Matthias Fripp for being here from UH and clearing up a little bit about the complexities of balancing a grid and some of the tools he's made to help fix it. So see you next week, Friday. Aloha.